Abraham Lincoln stood out in a crowd as much for his wit and rollicking humor as for his height. Here is a warm, appealing biography of our Civil War president, illustrated with dozens of carefully chosen photographs and prints. Russell Freedman begins with a lively account of Abraham Lincoln's boyhood, his career as a country lawyer, and his courtship and marriage to Mary Todd. Then the author focuses on the presidential years, 1861 to 1865, skillfully explaining the many complex issues Lincoln grappled with as he led a deeply divided nation through the Civil War. The book's final chapter is a moving account of that tragic evening in Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. Lincoln, a photobiography, concludes with a sampling of Lincoln writings and a detailed list of Lincoln historical sites. He was a child of royalty, born and raised to defend tradition, but his African name, meaning tree shaker, hinted at a very different future. Nelson Mandela would spend most of his life shaking his country to its roots. In South Africa, Europeans had invented a bizarre system called apartheid. Merciless laws kept power and wealth in the hand of whites, who treated the Africans as foreigner in their own land. For challenging this cruel system, Mandela would be condemned as his country's most notorious outlaw and imprisoned for 27 years. He would emerge to lead a peaceful revolution, becoming the father of a new South Africa and one of the world's most inspiring heroes. This is his story. For most people, the name Adolf Hitler represents the darkest, most abominable possibilities of human nature. To this day, almost 60 years after his death, Hitler is a figure who inspires anger, fear, and hatred. A brilliant politician, Hitler held the entire German nation in his sway with promises of renewal and prosperity, even as he devised a strategy to dominate most of Europe. As he systematically carried out his plan, he set World War II in motion. Meanwhile, he managed to convince many rational German citizens that Jews were the root of all evil, instigating the deaths of more than 6 million men, women, and children. In a straightforward and non-sensational manner, James Cross Giblin explores the forces that shaped the man as well as the social conditions that furthered his rapid rise to power. He traces the arc of Hitler's life from his childhood in Austria and his youthful ambition to be an artist to his final days in an embattled bunker under Berlin. What emerges is a portrait of a charismatic leader as well as a deeply disturbed man, a combination that has proved deadly time and time again throughout history. Brought up in a privileged family, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had every opportunity in front of him. As a young man, he found a path in politics and quickly began to move into the public eye. That ascent seemed impossible when he contracted polio and lost the use of his legs. But with a will of steel, he fought the disease and public perception of his disability to become President of the United States of America. FDR used that same will to guide his country through a crushing depression and a horrendous world war. He understood Adolf Hitler and what it would take to stop him before almost any other world leader did. But to accomplish his greater goals, he made difficult choices that sometimes compromised the ideals of fairness and justice. FDR is one of America's most intriguing presidents, lionized by some and villainized by others. National Book Award finalist Albert Marin explores the life of a fascinating, complex man who was ultimately one of the greatest leaders our country has known. When I was born on October 27, 1913, there were no doctors or nurses around with their instruments, just a medicine woman who specialized in child delivery. With incense of burning cedar and the singing of sacred songs, I came into the world. I was singing too, but they probably thought I was wailing. Thus begins the story of a Crow chief, and it tells his story of leadership. Princess Victoria woke one morning in June 1837 to discover that her uncle had died and she was now queen. She was just 18 years old, but she accepted her new duties with gusto, going on to reign for 63 years. Her influence was so far-reaching that her decades on the British throne came to bear her name, the Victorian period. It was an era that witnessed enormous change, from evolving social rules to the advent of industrialization, from the introduction of the theory of evolution to the vast expansion of the British Empire. Many people questioned their beliefs and way of life. Victoria's days inside castle walls were also extraordinary, filled with intrigue and drama, rumor and innuendo, not to mention questionable consorts, scheming advisors, assassination attempts, and a great love. Catherine Reef once again brings history vividly to life in the sumptuously illustrated and sweeping account of Queen Victoria, a confident, strong-minded, and influential woman. Frantic shouts and cries awaken a young girl. Her West African village is being attacked. She is dragged out of her home and watches in horror as her parents are murdered before her eyes. The attacking warriors examine her and notice the markings on her face. They are the markings of a princess. The girl is captured and held for a ritual in which she will be killed. Then in 1850, on the very day set for her death, a British naval officer rescues her. She is christened Sarah Forbes Bonetta and taken to England. There she is presented to Queen Victoria, who decides to provide for the upbringing of this young orphaned princess. Walter Dean Myers discovered a body of letters concerning Sarah and some actually written by her in a rare book and ephemera shop in London. What he saw there fascinated him, and he set out to unearth the details of her unique and engaging life. He found an extraordinary story of royalty, of race, of class, of belonging, and of identity. Now, after years of meticulous research, Myers unveils this arresting portrait of Sarah Forbes Bonetta, African princess. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson is perhaps best remembered for these stirring words signaling a new nation's intent and its promise for the future. But writing the Declaration of Independence, for which he won scant fame in his own time, was only one accomplishment in a long and illustrious life. Noted biographer Milton Meltzer examines the public and private Thomas Jefferson, revealing a complicated man whose ideals and actions were sometimes at odds. In a political career that spanned 5 decades but gave Jefferson little pleasure, he championed the rights so eloquently expressed in the Declaration. Yet, as president, he occasionally was tempted to try to deny these rights to his critics. And while he condemned the evil of slavery, he was supported his whole life by enslaved blacks and never truly accepted the principle of racial equality. "If you're never idle, you'll be surprised at what you may accomplish," Jefferson once counseled a friend. True to his words, as a scientist, diplomat, and architect, philosopher, agriculturalist, and educator, Jefferson achieved renown in many fields. In this powerful epic biography, David McCullough unfolds the adventurous life journey of John Adams, the brilliant, fiercely independent, often irascible, always honest Yankee patriot who spared nothing in his zeal for the American Revolution, who rose to become the second president of the United States and save the country from blundering into an unnecessary war, who was learned beyond all but a few and regarded by some as out of his senses, and whose marriage to the wise and vigilant Abigail Adams is one of the most moving love stories in American history. Like his masterly Pulitzer Prize-winning biography Truman, David McCullough's John Adams has the sweep and vitality of a great novel. It is both a riveting portrait of an abundantly human man and a vivid evocation of his time, much of it drawn from an outstanding collection of Adams' family letters and diaries. In particular, the more than 1,000 surviving letters between John and Abigail Adams, nearly half of which have never been published, provide extraordinary access to their private lives and make it possible to know John Adams as no other major American of his founding era. As he has with stunning effect in his previous books, McCullough tells the story from within, from the point of view of the amazing 18th century and of those who, caught up in events, had no sure way of knowing how things would turn out. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, the British spy Edward Bancroft, Madame Lafayette and Jefferson's Paris interest Maria Cosway, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, the scandalmonger James Callender, Sally Hemings, John Marshall, Talleyrand, and Aaron Burr all figure in this panoramic chronicle, as does, importantly, John Quincy Adams, the adored son who Adams would live to see become president. Crucial to this story, as it was to history, is the relationship between Adams and Thomas Jefferson, born opposites, one a Massachusetts farmer's son, the other a Virginia aristocrat and slave master, one short and stout, the other tall and spare. Adams embraced conflict, Jefferson avoided it. Adams had great humor, Jefferson very little. But they were alike in their devotion to their country. At first they were ardent co-revolutionaries, then fellow diplomats and close friends. With the advent of the two political parties, they became arch-rivals, even enemies, in the intense struggle for the presidency in 1800, perhaps the most vicious election in history. Then, amazingly, they became friends again, and ultimately, incredibly, they died on the same day, their day of days, July 4th, in the year 1826. Much about John Adams' life will come as a surprise to many readers. His courageous voyage to France on the frigate Boston in the winter of 1778, and his later trek over the Pyrenees are exploits that few would have dared and that few readers will ever forget. It is a life encompassing a huge arc. Adams lived longer than any president. The story ranges from the Boston Massacre to to Philadelphia in 1776, to the Versailles of Louis XVI, from Spain to Amsterdam, from the court of St. James, where Adams was the first American to stand before King George III as a representative of the new nation, to the raw, half-finished Capitol by the Potomac, where Adams was the first president to occupy the White House. This is history on a grand scale, a book about politics and war and social issues, but also about human nature, love, religious faith, virtue, ambition, friendship, and betrayal, and the far-reaching consequences of noble ideas. Above all, John Adams is an enthralling, often surprising story of one of the most important and fascinating Americans who ever lived.